Behavioral Neuroscience, Chapter 18, Segment 4. Some aspects of consciousness are easier to study than others. Cognitively impenetrable means that the data processing operations of the central nervous system are unconscious. Easy problem of consciousness is understanding how particular patterns of neural activity create specific conscious experiences. A more difficult problem is constraint-free reconstruction of conscious experiences, which is the ability to read what a person is perceiving rather than just identifying items on the basis of the previous training. Hard problem consciousness is understanding the brain processes that result in a person's subjective experience of the contents of consciousness. Qualia is a purely subjective experience of perception. Our subjective consciousness is closely tied up with the notion of free will or feelings of agency, which is the perception that our conscious self is the author of our actions and decisions. There will be a neural substrate for the universe feeling of having free will. Conscious experiences of intention may come relatively late in the process of deciding what to do. The frontal lobes govern our most complex behaviors. The frontal region has been regarded as the seat of intelligence and abstract thinking. The posterior portion of frontal cortex includes the primary motor and premotor regions. The more anterior portion, called the prefrontal cortex, is immensely interconnected with the rest of the brain and is associated with high-level cognition. It is subdivided into dorsolateral region and the orbitofrontal region. They're prominent in humans and apes, but it is a smaller portion of the cerebral cortex in other mammals. Carl Jacobson, in 1930, explored the delayed response learning in chimpanzees. The chimpanzees were shown where food was hidden, but they had to wait before they were allowed to reach for it. The chimp's performance lesions showed striking impairments with the simple task compared to the animals with the sustained regions in other parts of the brain. Phineas Gage. Phineas Gage worked as blasting rocks to clear a path for railroads, and one day the steel rod he was working with struck a spark and the charge went off, which shot the rod into his head. The rod pierced his left cheek, passed behind his left eye, and went out of his skull, and he landed almost 60 feet away. He was thrown onto the ground, he was convulsing, and then 2 minutes later he spoke. He got up, walked to the car, and drove into town. He walked into the doctor's office to get his wounds cleaned, and no one thought he was going to live, and the undertaker even made him a coffin. He lived and worked menial jobs for the next 12 years, but he changed. He was rude and aimless, and his powers of attention and concentration were impaired. The rod damaged both frontal lobes, and his brain would never be the same. This is one of the most famous neuroscience studies. Frontal lobe injury in humans leads to emotional, motor, cognitive changes. People with discrete prefrontal lesions express an unusual collection of emotional, motor, and cognitive changes. The emotional reactivity of these patients shows a persistent strange apathy, broken by bouts of euphoria, impulse concern, and no care for the past or future. They have an array of strange impairments in their behavior, especially in the realm of executive function or high-level control of other cognitive functions in order to attend to important stimuli and make suitable plans for action. Regions of dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, along with anterior portion of the cingulate, are closely associated with executive control. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is also crucial for working memory. Patients with frontal lesions often struggle with tasks, shifting, and tend to perseverate, which is to continue beyond a reasonable degree in any activity. The overall level of motor activity is diminished in these patients. The regions of the cortex may be important for organizing the diverse aspects of goal-directed behavior, including the capacity for prolonged attention and sensitivity to potential rewards and punishments. The orbital frontal cortex seems important for forming associations between hedonic experiences and reward signals from elsewhere in the brain. Neuroeconomics identifies the brain regions active during decision-making. Neuroeconomics is the study of the brain mechanisms at work during economic decision-making, and our attention to environmental factors and evaluation of rewards has a tremendous impact on these decisions. There are two main systems that underlie this process. The ventromedial prefrontal cortex plus dopamine-based reward system of the basal forebrain serves as the valuation system, which is a network that ranks choices on the basis of their perceived worth and potential reward. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and parietal regions is thought to be the choice system. shifting through the evaluated alternatives and producing the conscious decision. The prefrontal cortex inhibits impulse decisions, enforcing our loss aversion. As people become more uncertain, the prefrontal cortex becomes more active. When people have made the wrong choice and that they regret, the activity increases in the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. Reflection of the accuracy of one's own decision-making processes is an aspect of metacognition, one of the central features of human consciousness. The cutting edge, putting the U in YouTube. The best current technology for tracking the activity of the brain is the fMRI. It is not based directly on neural activity. Instead, it localizes activity related to depletion of oxygen in the blood that results from heightened activation of nearby neurons. Bold is blood oxygen level dependent. Bold signals measured from fMRIs are slow compared to the rapid electrical activity of the brain.